Have you guys got that?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Emily. You were a little bit quiet on the microphone, but hopefully that'll be okay.
Okay, I'll speak up. So I'm Emily and I'm a marine species advisor at the JNCC, and together with my colleagues Loma and Nikki updated the Marine Mammal Review. So what's happening? So in general, geographic range shifts, reduction in suitable habitat, changes in food web dynamics and increased prevalent disease are being seen as consequences of climate change for marine mammals. Around the UK, our review found the strongest evidence for potential range shifts and changes in food web dynamics and changes in habitat use. So I'll start with range shifts. Marine species are moving about 4 times faster than terrestrial. So marine species on average are moving at 72 kilometres per decade compared to 17 in terrestrial species. There is some evidence of it around the UK, although present our kind of ability to detect trends is slightly weaker than we'd hope. But a recent analysis of stranding records found that the proportion of recorded warm water species such as short-beaked common dolphins and striped dolphins had increased, whereas cold water adapted species such as Atlantic white-sided and white-beaked had decreased, which does indicate that there are range shifts occurring. In general, at the moment, the evidence is suggesting many of the range shifts already identified could be reflected of changes in prey populations rather than direct impacts of temperature. So harbour porpoise in the North Sea have been shifting over the last couple of decades, and it's thought to reflect changes in sand eel populations. This kind of brings me on to changes in food web dynamics. So it's not my area, but it's important to understand in the context of marine mammals. So climate change is impacting on the timing, length and strength of summer stratification and the corresponding spring plankton blooms, which can lead to trophic mismatches and impacts throughout the food web. Several key prey species from marine mammal time their key life history events around the blooms, and if these aren't matching up the same way, then this can lead to poor recruitment success and less prey available. There's also evidence that there's changes in the relative abundance of copepod species. So Arctic species are declining where warm water species are expected to increase. However, I did find some debate in the literature of whether warm water species would be able to fully replace the Arctic species. Warm water species are seen to have a lower lipid content and lower biomass. And if they can't fully replace them, then we may see a decline in productivity at lower levels, which would then kind of filter through to the impact on marine mammals. Both these changes in food web dynamics and the geographic range shifts are having impacts on species interactions. So changes in prey taken, if prey availability is declining, will impact on predator-prey dynamics and risk effects. And we may also see increased competition. So, for example, short-beaked common dolphins are generalist foragers capable of changing prey depending on what's available. And they may be, if they're moving further north, they may be overlapping with white-beaked dolphins, which are a bit more specialist, a bit more limited in what they can eat, and therefore white-beaked dolphins may be being outcompeted, and we may see a decline because of that. That leads me on to what could happen. So much of what was identified in the last review is still true, and we do have difficulties in determining what may happen to marine mammals just because they're quite hard to study. They're highly mobile and they dive deeply, so it's quite hard to study them. But that being said, we may see increases in range shifts, potentially as a direct consequence of temperature increases. So marine mammals are able to regulate their own temperatures, but as temperature increases beyond the optimum, it'll require more energy to do so, and so it may be easier or more beneficial just to move northwards. For example, pilot whales in the Northwest Atlantic are thought to be moving northwards as a direct consequence of temperature, because they're moving 3 times faster than preferred prey species. In baleen whales, we may also see changes in their breeding grounds. So several breeding grounds are becoming too hot for them, and they may choose to change where they go. However, they're quite a specific requirement in some species for their breeding grounds. So it may be, again, easier, more beneficial to change the timings of migration, so they just arrive there when it's slightly cooler. For the UK, this will impact on when they use the migration corridor along the west coast, and ecosystem services they provide at certain times of year. So cetaceans, particularly large whales, play a big impact on normal ecosystem functioning, and they can impact on the global carbon budget, nutrient cycling, risk effects, and climate regulation. And so changes in the use of the marine environment could result in large-scale declines in ecosystem health. There are also increasing reports of the potential for infectious disease to increase. This may be through range shifts of both host and pathogens, which lead to novel interactions, or potentially the environment's becoming more favourable for the pathogen and therefore their higher survival rates. May also be that increased thermal stress in marine mammals as temperatures are increasing put them at higher vulnerability of disease. It's worth noting that pinnipeds are thought to be more likely to be impacted just because they're exposed to pathogens in both the terrestrial and marine environments. However, it's not all bad, and the dilution effect also needs to be considered. So when you have many hosts, you decrease the likelihood of infection in a good host that will then pass the disease on. And if northward range shifts are occurring, or poleward range shifts are occurring, then we may see increased biodiversity at mid-latitudes, and therefore the dilution effect would kick in and we may see a decrease in infectious disease. It's quite complex, and we have also identified that harmful algal blooms are expected to increase, and poisoning from these may be negating any impact the dilution effect would have. And then finally, on what could happen, well, we're likely to see consequences to reproduction. So when faced with insufficient resources, animals are required to trade off between reproduction and survival, and for marine mammals that have multiple opportunities throughout one lifetime to breed, trade-off may occur between current and future reproductive opportunities. This might help explain in pinnipeds why in some sites around the UK pupping dates are getting earlier. So older females have less likelihood of survival, or after a certain point have less likelihood of survival, and they may prioritise current opportunities to breed. Or they may simply just have more resources built up to cope with fluctuations in the environment than younger females. And older females are seen to breed earlier, so that might explain slightly earlier pupping dates at some sites. This could help populations because older mothers and earlier pupping dates are thought to increase the likelihood of raising a pup successfully to weaning. But you would have to consider the possibility of multiple skipped breeding attempts. And also, this could be very site specific. This isn't a trend. This is just something that's been identified in a couple of sites. Similar principles also apply in cetaceans. I've found a wee bit less literature on this, but early term abortions, less investment in the fetus, suppressed ovulation, or kind of delayed sexual maturation are all thought to occur when conditions aren't the optimum. But how confident are we in this? So overall, we assess confidence as medium. Since the last review, there have been increased reports of range shifts and of disease occurrence and novel diseases, kind of regionally and globally. But for environmental changes beyond temperature, we don't know a lot, so it's important to better understand the impacts of reduced oxygen availability or ocean acidification. There's also the difficulty in determining causation versus correlation. So there's a lot of stressors in the marine environment. Some may be increasing with climate change because they're being put in to combat future climate change, and determining what is a direct consequence of climate change and what is not is quite difficult and something that needs work. This brings me on to my key challenges. Well, most of these, if not all of these, I think were the same identified in the last review. But the principal one is the long-term monitoring of marine mammals. So in the UK, at the moment, monitoring is typically characterised by irregular large-scale surveys, and then smaller regional surveys that do happen more frequently, but don't allow us to identify trends in the same way. And so more work is needed here to develop some sort of longer, larger-scale monitoring programme for marine mammals. Programmes like the JCTP, which was launched this year and worked on by some of my colleagues, may help because that's collating effort-related data on marine mammals into one single accessible resource. But more monitoring is also needed, and collation of data that the JCTP can't currently take. We also need to increase our understanding of cumulative impacts. So I said earlier about determining causation from correlation and determining what was the direct consequence of climate change. And while that is important, it is also important to recognise that nothing acts in isolation. And with increasing renewable developments or kind of shipping increasing, then they will all add together to impact on marine mammals, and it's important to understand how they will react to this. Some kind of ecosystem modelling techniques could help, but at the moment there's a lot of limitations around them. And so development here would certainly help improve our understanding and our confidence in what's happening to marine mammals. And then finally, increased understanding of impacts of bottom-up changes. So some marine mammals are capable of switching prey species, so may be less impacted by environmental fluctuations. However, some prey may be more energetically beneficial than others. And so changes to that less energetically beneficial species may still result in kind of reproductive or survival costs. And we're just not quite sure about this at the moment. I'm not quite sure I'm doing for time, but this is just quick key messages which I'll rattle through. So what's happening? Geographic range shifts. Marine species are shifting 4 times faster. Environmental changes impact on species at the base of the food web and kind of filtering up to marine mammals. And this is having interactions on species interactions. And yeah, evidence for range shifts and extra elemental records, etc., is limited to just a few anecdotal records and difficult to determine any trends. And what could happen? Continued range shifts, more direct impacts from temperature, changes in ecosystem services and value of cetaceans for climate regulation, changes in disease and reproductive consequences. Thanks for listening.